Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Offshore Wind Podcast. My name's Stewart Mullin. I'm the Chief Industry Officer at the Global Wind Energy Council, and I am joined at the desk, almost as always, by Rebecca Williams, the Deputy CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council. Rebecca, welcome back. We missed you at the last recording, but you are at an IEA event.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I mean, I like to remain a little elusive in the podcast. I come and go, keep the listeners on their toes. But yeah, the real reason this time was because I was at the IEA in Paris. Very good meeting there around one of the reports that they're currently working on in the background on supply chain. So fascinating discussions, but it meant that sadly I couldn't join the podcast recording last time.
Yeah, and you and I got back from the GWIX APAC Summit about a couple of weeks ago now. But our guest today, it's fair to say, she was probably the hit of the summit. And if people weren't aware of what was going on in the Philippines before they hit the APAC Summit, they definitely had renewed interest about what was going on in the Philippines after the APAC Summit. And I'm very exceptionally pleased to welcome to the Offshore Wind Podcast, Dr. Rowena Cristina Guevarra, the Undersecretary of the Department of Energy in the Philippines. Secretary Guevarra, welcome to the Offshore Wind Podcast.
Thank you. Nice to see you again, Stewart and Rebecca.
Thanks very much. Hey, before we get into the meat of the podcast, can you give our audience a little bit of background about yourself and how did you get into politics and how did you end up at the Department of Energy?
My full name, as you mentioned, Rowena Cristina L. Guevarra, is too long. People call me Gev, like Giga Electron Volts. I'm currently serving as Undersecretary or equivalent of Vice Minister for the renewable energy and electric power industry at the Department of Energy in the Philippines. I'm an engineer by profession with a doctoral degree in electrical engineering systems and a second doctoral degree in music.
Okay, in the music, what was the background or what was the doctorate in music?
I studied indigenous people's music in Maguindanao del Norte in Mindanao.
How do you combine these passions today, you said, Guevarra? Are you combining them in how you approach policy making, or how does the music influence you and what you seek to achieve?
I've always believed that energy and music are quite similar. Both are about bringing different elements together and making them work in sync. That's very much what we do at the Department of Energy, where we are responsible for ensuring reliable, affordable, sustainable energy for all Filipinos. And in my role, I oversee policy formulation, long-term energy planning, and renewable energy development, including offshore wind, which is one of our most exciting frontiers today.
Yeah, fantastic. We're really looking forward to getting into that. And maybe we can circle back to, looking at how that music and energy aligns in the real world a little bit later on in the podcast. But I wanted to get into I guess the real reason why we're here. Offshore wind in the Philippines. Can you give us a little bit of background about what it was like in the early days and why did the Filipino government start looking at the offshore wind as part of their energy mix?
I have to take you way back. Between 2018 and early 2022, the Department of Energy already awarded 30 offshore wind energy service contracts to both local and foreign developers. These early contracts allowed them to conduct resource assessment and feasibility studies, demonstrating that industry confidence was already present even before a national roadmap existed. And then in 2022, with the help of World Bank and its Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, or SMAP, we published the Philippines Offshore Wind Roadmap. It showed that what our developers were seeing was validated and that the Philippines has over 178 gigawatts of technical offshore wind potential, one of the highest in Asia. It also highlighted what we needed, clear policies, streamlined permitting, and strong coordination across government agencies.
So 170 gigawatts of technical potential, that is huge. And it's I can understand why it's been such an interest to the industry. Some of those early conversations with developers, what were they looking for from the Filipino government, and how was your interaction with them? What were the type of conversations you were having with those early stage developers?
Right away when we came in, our administration came in July 2022, we realized from the potential investors that they are mostly 100% foreign owned. And so in November 2022, the DOE issued a landmark circular that allows renewable energy, including offshore wind, to be 100% foreign owned. This basically announced to the world that the Philippines is open for renewable energy investors. And then by April 2023, the President signed Executive Order number 21, establishing a whole-of-government policy and administrative framework for offshore wind. Only offshore wind. No other renewable energy technologies have this kind of executive order, showing that we heard the needs of the industry players and we are willing to help them develop offshore wind in the Philippines.
Yusuf Guevara, maybe just to paint a bit of a picture for our listeners who, international listeners, they're from all over the world. Could you maybe just elaborate a little bit more on the situation with energy in the Philippines and the wider kind of objectives and maybe some of the opportunities and challenges you face? You mentioned the immense technical potential when it comes to offshore wind, but I just wondered if you could give us a bit more color around how the energy mixes in the Philippines and what the next steps are, what you're looking to achieve.
Rebecca, you have to understand that the previous 6 years before we came in 2022, there were hardly any new energy resource coming into the energy mix. And therefore, by the time we came in, the demand supply margin was very thin. And we really needed a very fast way to get renewables to come in because we have a Renewable Energy Act that prioritizes renewable energy development in the country. However, it was ironic that when it was created in 2008, the policy for renewable energy, our renewable energy in the generation mix was 35%. But today it is at 22%. And the reason was that we had a energy crisis, and then mostly coal-fired power plants came in, overtaking the existing renewables back in 2008. So we are in a situation where there are challenges, which is we lack supply, and then there are opportunities. We have many interested renewable energy developers coming into the country. And so we fast-tracked the applications for renewable energy service contracts of these investors. We use what we call the Energy Virtual One-Stop Shop, which is a computerized way for developers to apply for service contract. And we have very strict deadlines. According to the law that established the Virtual One-Stop Shop, if we fail to process any application within the specified number of days, it is deemed approved. And so today, we have over 1,400 service contracts already awarded.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think also the virtual one-stop shop, that's becoming a real symbolic piece of kind of legislation or a symbolic initiative, something that certainly GWEC has recommended be rolled out in many other markets. So congratulations on that particular policy initiative. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah. And Rebecca, because of that facilitation from those 30 early contracts, today we have 91 active offshore wind energy service contracts totaling about 65 gigawatts.
So the picture that you're painting there, Yusuf Guevara, is one of, rapidly growing demand, a power-hungry nation, and a government that's willing to, take those tough steps in order to put in place the right framework to really progress things. And I think that's certainly what came through at the APAC conference a couple of weeks ago, in in quite an emphatic way.
Yes, Rebecca, we do have a target of 35% renewable energy in the generation mix in 5 years' time. And we're coming from 22%. I think it's obvious that offshore wind is the way to get there as quickly as we can because the numbers are huge.
What was the properties of offshore wind that makes it such an appealing technology for a government like the Philippines? All around the world we're seeing, various headwinds at the moment around the offshore wind industry, and here we are in the Philippines being all in and providing such great frameworks. And as Rebecca mentioned, this one-stop shop stuff, I mean, this is just fantastic from an industry perspective. Anything that really makes it easier for our industry to engage with government in these issues, in these areas, and that can add speed to the process is very much welcome. But what was it specifically about offshore wind, apart from the technical resource that you had at your doorstep?
Stewart, the other number one renewable energy in the Philippines is solar. And solar requires land. In the Philippines, we are an agricultural country. And if you look at our map, we are 2/3 water and only 1/3 land. Therefore, it makes sense that we should use our water to provide some energy. And offshore wind, being the way that it is already mature in many markets across the world, makes sense that we should venture into offshore wind for the Philippines so that we will not compete with food for land using solar.
Yeah. In terms of enabling offshore wind, and for those companies at the very beginning, I'm still very interested in how you engage with those people, those first movers, and also how you've kind of worked with them and how you've consulted with industry along the way to be able to get to a point where you actually have created such a favourable system for industry to get involved, or to making it favourable processes rather for industry to actually get involved with the government and drive this development. Is there any, if other governments are starting out on their journey now, what would you recommend to them as part of that, as part of them starting out of their offshore wind journey?
I think the key to our journey, to get really started with serious investors, was that we had a lot of conversations with them. We maintained an open door policy in our offices, such that we talk to anyone who wants to talk with us. And if there are problems that they are encountering, we make sure that we solve the problem together. So, for example, we all know that offshore wind consenting and permitting is a very complex process, not just in the Philippines, but all over the world. So what we did with what we call our front runner projects, we said, okay, give us your work plan in detail, and then we will look at which permits or consents are needed, and we make sure that before you get there, we have already made agreements with that particular agency to facilitate your application. In such a manner, we ensure that there are no roadblocks for our developers when it comes to getting permits and consents with the other government agencies. Of course, the hardest hurdle for them is going to the community. But because these are developers in other countries and they know how to work with the communities, we find that the communities are happy with them.
I was going to touch on that. You mentioned having your door is always open to the industry. Have you experienced that in the early days? Were the developers like the traditional developers that you see in other markets? Were they more speculative, and how do you actually ensure that the developers that you're engaging with are actually going to be qualified enough to be able to deliver these projects on time and in accordance with your energy goals? Because it's pretty important that these things get built when they say they're going to get built.
That's a very good question, Stewart. We learned from our lesson from our green energy auction. We had our first auction in 2022, and while almost the entire 90% of the capacity was subscribed, many of the projects did not materialize. And what we learned from those first two auctions was that we have to make it harder for bidders to join the auction. And so we came up with new omnibus rules and regulations for service contract application. So before, for example, for solar, they can just have a letter of intent. But today we require possessory rights before they can be given service contracts. In a similar manner, for those in the offshore wind business who would like to join our auction, we require proof that certain landmark milestones have already been completed before they can participate in our auction. In that manner, in the award for the auction and also in the award for the service contracts, we're able to separate the serious players from those who are just flippers.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, I think we as an industry, we owe it to countries that we engage with to make sure that we actually do have the capabilities. And I guess, a few years ago, we saw a lot of uh, developers in many, many different markets, kind of, almost like a speculator. They put, they go and do early development works in each market and see where the market's going to, which market's going to pay dividends for them over time. But it's great to see that, and I'm glad to see that there's some sort of rigor now that you're confident that those that you're engaging with are actually going to be able to deliver the projects in a timely and in a timely manner.
Stewart,
What
let me also add that because our developers are required to submit a work plan, and we actually watch where they are when they are reporting to us, and if there is slippage that they cannot explain, we reserve the right to terminate their service contract. So we are very strict when it comes to following their work plan.
You said, Guevara, I mean, around the world now, we are seeing from some countries, some nations, maybe increased political instability. And from an investor perspective, obviously, instability is one of our foes, the industry's foe. How is the Philippines ensuring that you have that kind of continuity and visibility of that's required for investors to really ensure that they're going to be able to be with you and be with the Philippines for the long road?
Rebecca, that's a very good question and a very tough one. Um, in the Philippines, every 6 years, we elect a new president. And every 3 years, our local government uh, officials are elected. So those 3 and 6 year cycles. But there is the sanctity of contracts in the Philippines. We honor our contracts even though they are very difficult. And my favorite example is the Bataan nuclear power plant. We've paid for that entire power plant even though we had no intention of using it because it was written in a contract.
I
well,
think
that,
that's an excellent example to flag because certainly I think there can be a misperception sometimes for international investors that somehow there's an additional kind of risk element from developing or rapidly developing emerging economies, whereas actually GWEC analysis shows that the only countries that have ever broken energy contracts have been more mature markets for these technologies. So I think it's really important that our international listeners also understand that dynamic and understand what's at play there.
Yes, Rebecca, that power plant was finished in 1984, and we have had several presidents since that time, several government administrations, but it was paid for and completed about 2 administrations ago. So we are serious when it comes to energy contracts. We honor them.
um, one of the things that I'd like to explore in a little bit more detail is I mentioned at the very start of the show that you were the hit of the APAC conference, and one of the things that GWIC tries to do as part of our remit in working with in the APAC area is we are very big believers of this idea of regional collaboration and making sure that governments within a region can get together and speak about offshore wind development and work out, I guess, everything from supply chain to tips and tricks about actually how to get this done in a timely manner. For you personally, how do you see this idea of working with neighbouring governments, and how do you see the idea of regional collaboration for the Philippines?
I think I've already mentioned this during the APAC that it is impossible for any single country to develop offshore wind on its own. You are going to need your neighbors, and they are also going to need you. For example, since our meeting in Melbourne, we have already had 2 meetings with the Victoria government regarding offshore wind because we wanted to learn from each other. We had questions, they also had questions, and we were able to help each other. But more importantly, we know that one of the pain points for offshore wind would be the supply chain. If we do not coordinate, we will have a problem with the supply chain if we all go in at the same time. And so learning from each other, the schedule of when particular build or several builds are going to happen in a country will make sure that the supply chain is viable, not just for one single country, but for the entire region. And I think going to the APAC Wind Energy Summit in Melbourne was a very good experience for the Philippines because we were able to learn which countries are planning to get from which suppliers, and therefore we know and we are confident that our developers are going in the right direction in terms of the supply chain that they are pursuing.
Just on that, you guys being one of the first movers of the emerging markets in the APAC region, you must be pretty confident that suppliers and the supply chain is going to look favourable. I mean, when you're doing so many things right, it does give great investor certainty when you're starting to make these big investments. Have you seen much interest from, for example, turbine manufacturers or ancillary services around the Philippines? What piece of the pie would the Philippines like to have in the supply chain?
I have to state this clearly. The Philippines do not require localization of any parts for offshore wind. However, some things make sense to do in the Philippines because our tariff agreements with other countries are more favorable than our neighbors. So it makes sense to manufacture certain things in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, about 60 to 70% of our export is semiconductor and electronics. It is a strength from the manufacturing point of view. And therefore, the electronics parts of an offshore wind facility can actually be manufactured easily in the Philippines. And while we do not require localization, we have ventured and gone around the supply chain and invited them to seek go to the Philippines and see what we have here. And if they're interested in manufacturing any of the parts, we are going to connect them with the Department of Trade and Industry Board of Investment so that they can be facilitated in establishing any manufacturing in the Philippines.
That's fantastic news for anyone in the industry. And I mean, my personal background, I worked for turbine manufacturers for almost 15, 16 years before I joined GWIC. And a lot of my personal experience was spent speaking with governments around what supply chain we were going to put into those countries. And it's fair to say that I think every company wants to be able to provide some economic value for those countries actually doing offshore wind. But when you allow the supply chain the flexibility to find out what that value looks like, it is exceptionally helpful for the entire industry. So I can only thank you from my industry colleagues for having that approach, and I hope that it's very successful for the Philippines and in terms of what content actually comes to these projects, because as I said, you are going to be a first mover. There is going to be a strong need to be able to get components into the country. And so in a lot of cases, it does make sense, particularly when you've got such a strong pipeline, for these projects to be able to, or these investments to actually be as local as possible. So I wish you good luck with that. And yeah, it's again, another tick for the way that the Philippines is doing things is what we would like to see in all countries. Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to move back to something that Yusek Guevara said before around this kind of regional collaboration agenda. And, there's been a lot of discussions in geopolitical circles about the fracturing of global trade and the breaking down of some of those norms when it comes to multilateral engagements. But it struck me that at the APAC summit, actually, there was a great deal of desire for this collaboration in the region. I'm just wondering to what extent you think that could be structured in particular areas, or whether you think that will be a kind of less formal structure and more a kind of bilateral exchange, as you were saying. I mean, what do you think of the opportunities there to have something maybe that's slightly more structured?
I believe that offshore wind will progress faster when countries tackle the complex problems together. For example, on supply chains and vessels, Asia can benefit from coordinated orders, shared vessels, time sequence tenders. On the workforce and safety, maybe the Philippines Technical Education and Skills Development Authority and the Global Wind Organization align programs such as Jobs for RE. We are working to build mutual recognition of training standards across Asia. On ports and logistics with IFC and ADB, we're upgrading several ports, and shared port design standards and safeguards across Asia will improve efficiency. And on data and permitting, shared Met-Ocean baselines and interoperable systems like EVOS reduce duplication work and can be shared experience among the members in the region. And finally, maybe through World Bank, IFC, or ADB, or local banks and other climate financing institutions, maybe we can explore blended finance and green corridor projects linking ports to grids. These kinds of collaborations will make APAC offshore wind industry cheaper, faster, and safer.
Mr. Guevarra, I just want to also pick up on that point you made about blended finance, because I think that's really important. It's something that I know our team at GWEC have talked to your team about in a great deal of detail, and also with colleagues at World Bank Group, etc. Could you just kind of unpack the challenge on the blended finance piece a little bit more for the listeners? Because I think, Philippines, as Stewart was saying, is a first mover in the region, and we're really excited about the next steps for the Philippines. But I guess there are these potentially additional challenges or solutions that have to be found when it comes to the topic of financing. So could you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, Rebecca. In the Philippines, the Philippine government, we do not give subsidy for energy. And so our problem with blended financing is that multilateral banks require sovereign guarantee from the government. And this is something that the Philippine government will not do simply because energy is already deregulated in our country. And so I have requested ADB, IFC, and World Bank to figure out a way to do blended financing without requiring sovereign guarantee. Because that is the only way that our private sector investors in offshore wind and other RE developers will be able to benefit from blended financing.
Thank you for explaining that a little bit more. And I think, as I said, it's a really exciting development, because what happens in the Philippines here could not just be a first mover then within the region, but also more generally when it comes to financing offshore wind outside of those kind of core European markets that have historically been the centers of offshore wind. So we're really looking forward to helping contribute to that journey and seeing the next steps in those discussions.
Thank you, Rebecca.
If we were to perhaps look at some of the traditional challenges that we see around many markets of the world. So in offshore wind, we always, a country always has to look at the ports and grid connections. How are you placed in the Philippines around ports and grid connections? How does that piece of the puzzle look to fit in with your overall offshore wind ambitions?
For the grid, we are getting more confident by the day because our Energy Regulatory Commission has a new set of commissioners. And what we've seen so far is that they act very fast this time around. So one of the things that came out recently was what we call the regulatory reset for our grid operator. And because that came out in just 2 weeks after the new commission assumed their office, we're confident that the other regulatory resets for the transmission operator will come out fast. And because of that, we are sure that the transmission operator will actually build the needed transmission for offshore wind on time. So
Fantastic.
that's for the transmission. But for the port, that one is a little bit of a gray area that we are still in discussion with our developers. And we think that it is going to be our challenge, our main challenge in our auction, in our upcoming auction.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, and glad that you're, again, looking at this as a broader part of the challenge. I mean, we do see this across most markets, and this is one of the challenges for a market that's not used to doing offshore wind, because we do require, as an industry, very specific port designs. And so I also really like that idea of finding an Asian standard, like you mentioned before, of what that looks like for port design. That interoperability of ports is going to be perhaps a big piece to be able to unlock even quicker rollout of offshore wind in the future. One of the other areas that we always talk about in offshore wind, and we've been talking about it for a long time, and GWIC is really starting to reignite this discussion, is this area of floating offshore wind. And I know that the Philippines is, a lot of your offshore wind are going to be floating projects. Would you mind telling our listeners how you see floating offshore wind fitting into the offshore wind puzzle in the Philippines?
No, given the Philippines' deep waters, floating offshore wind could be very important to us. 90% of the 178 gigawatts has to be floating. So right now, our near-term focus is on fixed bottom because it's a low-hanging fruit for our green energy auction, while we lay the groundwork for floating offshore wind projects through World Bank IFC ADB technical studies on marine planning, ports, and grid readiness. What we think is important for floating in the Philippines is that it is going to give us higher energy outputs than the fixed bottom. And therefore, there is the urge for the Philippines to pursue floating offshore wind. However, we understand that the technology is not yet mature. And because we are just an emerging market, we have to wait for the technology for floating offshore wind to mature before we venture into that. But based on our plans, we are hoping that in the next green energy auctions that we will have, we'll be able to include floating offshore wind.
Fantastic. As I said, GWIC is really starting to, amongst much of the other work that we do, we are actually looking to establish having established a new focus on floating offshore wind to see what we can do as an industry to accelerate that. And hopefully that you guys can also play some sort of role in that process as well. Rebecca?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, Stuart. I think listeners are going to hear a lot more from GWEC on this topic going forwards. And also working in connection with like-minded governments, perhaps through the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, on how we can also get that dovetailing of ambition from governments and also making sure that the industry plays its part. So having that offer and acceptance, I think that's going to be really important.
Glad to hear that, Rebecca.
Sorry. Also, one of the other things that I wanted to have a look at is maybe we spoke about a little bit about the energy mix, etc., in the Philippines, but from the demand side of things, like the key demand centers, are you seeing that offshore wind will be feeding like primarily industrial hubs? Is it urban load centers, or is it a mix of both? Where's the benefit for offshore wind from the demand side?
Demand side, you have to understand that our energy demand is increasing by 5 to 6% per year. Therefore, we have lined up all the technologies that we're going to need in order to feed that demand with appropriate supply. And one of the new developments in the Philippines is data center hyperscalers. These data center hyperscalers require huge amounts of energy. And when I talked to them about 3 weeks ago, I learned that already there's 120 megawatts entering the country for data center hyperscaler, and that in the next 2 years, they plan to expand by another 500 megawatts. And we think that offshore wind is going to play an important role in meeting these large jumps in energy demand from a sector that is quite new to the Philippines. And we also imagine that as the price of electricity goes down in the Philippines, we'll be able to attract more industries. I'm very happy to report that we learned from the market operator that this is the year when the prices of electricity in the market is significantly lower in the last 25 years. As in, they're looking at the pre-COVID prices, and the prices today are even lower than the pre-COVID prices. So that is an indication that going in the direction of adding more and bigger capacities in our supply is really going to help lower the price of electricity and therefore attract new industries to locate in the Philippines. Because it's the number one complaint of industry players that the price of electricity is high in the Philippines. We're second to Singapore in the ASEAN region.
I think that's a fairly common complaint all around the world that we hear. But one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is how you view the topic of energy security and what offshore wind provides you and the Philippines in terms of energy security? Because this is another big question that we get in a lot of markets.
Stewart, I mentioned that we are targeting 35% renewable energy by 2030 and 50% renewable energy in the generation mix by 2040. This is primarily because of energy security. We were hard hit in the 2022 geopolitical problem. Our diesel plants, which are mostly located in our small islands, the price doubled, and therefore some islands had to go from 16 hours back to 8 hours. So we don't want that to happen in the future. And we think going for renewables, going for big renewables like offshore wind, is the way that we can secure energy in the Philippines.
So I think that's a really nice segue onto the next question, and you've outlined some of those desires from the Philippines perspective. You've got the auction coming up, really exciting time. What do you see are the key priorities for you to get that auction right? How are you going to mark your own homework, let's say?
First of all, we do have a target of 3,300 megawatts. We have checked that we have enough players who are planning to join the auction to fill in that particular capacity. We're also mindful of the requirements for grid and for port of all of these, what we call front runner offshore wind developers. And having done our homework, we are fairly confident with the way that we have designed the auction, such that it will be fair, it will be transparent, and that we will achieve our targets for offshore wind just for this first offer.
Okay, so we made a list there of the key criteria, and we'll come back to you, Yusek Guevarra, and maybe score it after the auction and see how you've done. Maybe a repeat episode of the podcast can have those reflections.
Just out of curiosity, so again, I mean, one of the things that we've also spoken about ad nauseum in the offshore wind sector is making sure that we get the volume of each auction and making sure there's enough volume for the players to be interested. How do you, as a government, how do you ensure that there is, I think you said over 2 gigawatts of offshore wind in this auction, how do you guys ensure that there is enough volume to keep the market interested and coming regularly enough into the market to actually make sure that the market is a viable market for industry?
First, on the capacity, based on our clean energy scenario in our Philippine Energy Plan, we are looking at 19 gigawatts offshore wind by 2050 in the clean energy scenario 1. But if all of this new industry come in, we are willing to go up to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. So the capacity requirement is there. And as I mentioned, even now we have 91 active offshore wind service contracts totaling 65 gigawatts. And we are watching these developers closely and looking if they are achieving the milestones that they should that they have written in their plans, and we are making sure that they are not encountering problems with any of the permittings and the consenting with other government agencies. And having said that, we can see that the appetite for investing in the Philippines for offshore wind is there, because even as we speak, we continue evaluating new applications for offshore wind developers in the Philippines.
And so if we fast forward to 2030 and Rebecca and I are still doing this podcast in 5 years' time, and we have you back on the show in 5 years' time, and we reflect back into 2025, where do you think we'll be in 2030? What will have happened and what will be about to happen?
I imagine that by that time we should have about 3 gigawatts of offshore wind already installed, and that new builds, maybe another 5 gigawatts, are going to be in the pipeline. Because that's the only way that we're going to hit 19 gigawatts or 50 gigawatts by 2050. But by having that pipeline of projects for offshore wind and, of course, for other renewable energy as well.
It's fantastic to hear that ambition, and it's fantastic to hear exactly how quick that you guys want to move with these things, because you look at the traditional development pipelines for some countries, and the Philippines are exceptionally quick compared to other markets, and it seems to be really gaining traction with our developers and industry alike. One thing, how would you view, when you look in 2030 at your neighbours also doing offshore wind? Are there any neighbours that you're confident of that are going to be, you're still going to be collaborating with then, or how do you see that role of regional collaboration in post 2030, or as we move to the 2050 targets?
By that time, the supply chain in APAC will be well established. And I imagine that when we reach that point, because of these conversations that we are having, we would be able to optimally schedule our auctions, our supply chain, and make sure that no country is left behind in terms of wanting and doing the development for offshore wind.
Maybe just to come in there, because I think the question is often phrased in Europe, what can APAC or Asia learn from Europe? I think very soon we'll see a flipping of that equation, and the question will actually be, what can Europe now learn from Asia and from the front runner countries in Asia? Because I definitely feel a kind of changing of the guard moment here, and it's really exciting from my perspective. So yeah, I think lots to look forward to in the region.
Yeah, and Rebecca, you have to add to that the ASEAN is now, by this month, we are going to have a memorandum of agreement on the ASEAN power grid, which will allow the 10 member states to send or receive energy from electricity from each other. And next year, the Philippines will be the chair of the ASEAN, and therefore we're going to push for the um, solidification of plans for creating the ASEAN power grid. Right now, we are relying on bilaterals among ASEAN member states, but hopefully by the end of next year, we will have a very solid plan of how we're going to build and fund and regulate the ASEAN power grid.
Thanks for laying that down, that marker for the ASEAN presidency next year. I think we're really looking forward to seeing what comes out of that, and really good to hear about those plans.
Yeah, I think that's probably a great place to look at wrapping up the conversation this time around. So, Secretary Guevarra, if you were to, talking about your love of music, and if is there a metaphor, an appropriate metaphor somehow between the music piece and the energy piece that kind of, I guess, paints a picture for the future of how you see offshore wind in the Philippines?
I always believe energy and music share the same language of rhythm, harmony, and melody. And my role at the department is like a conductor. I will not have to play every instrument, but I'll make sure everyone plays from the same score: the developers, the agencies, the investors, and the communities. And my job is to maintain the rhythm such that developers are aware of the timing, produce harmony such that everyone plays together and support each other, and ensure that every instrument stick to their assigned melody and contribute to the symphony called the Philippine Offshore Wind Development. When we play together, it brings strength and balance to our energy sector, and its beauty attracts new businesses to accelerate the economic growth of the Philippines and the region with a cleaner, brighter, and sustainable future for our children.
What a beautiful metaphor to end the podcast. That's probably the best ending
Can we
we've ever
steal
had
that
to
one for Gina?
Wow. Look, thank you so much for that. One of the things that we always do when we wrap up this podcast is we ask our guests, has there been anything in the news that's caught your attention of recent times? Has there been anything that you've been excited about or worried about that you would like to share with our listeners?
Whenever we look at offshore wind across the APAC, we always look at what's going on in EU, in Europe, because we are basically where they were maybe 5, 10 years ago. And when we see that particular developments are pushing through, we are excited. And then when particular developments are not happening, it makes us nervous and makes us review our plan to make sure we don't make the same mistakes. And of late, we have seen some of the pullouts in some developments. And while it makes us nervous, I think it makes us think twice about all the plans that we are making, and we are making sure that all the I's are dotted and all the T's are dashed. And it's not fear, but hope that if we learn from them, maybe we'll not make the same mistakes.
Yeah, fantastic. And Rebecca, what about yourself? What's caught your attention of recent times?
Well, maybe just reflecting on the week I've had at the IEA. So the IEA just the other day released a new report, that's the International Energy Agency, on the topic of renewables. And what they found was that renewables are continuing at pace, and that this is not an energy addition, it is an energy transition. And I think for me, whilst that's a bit wider than just the offshore wind sphere, that's really exciting and really shows that the world is moving in this direction, this age of electricity. And offshore wind, I believe, as we've been talking in this podcast about, will play a fundamental role within that. As we mentioned at the top of the podcast, I was also at the IEA discussing the topic of supply chain earlier this week. This theme of regional collaboration was coming through so strongly in those conversations, and in particular, how that can be moved forward in Asia. So really exciting developments there, some good new reports and some good content for the global community here to unpick. And those are my picks for this week, Stewart.
Fantastic. And well, I guess for myself, it was the key takeaways from the APAC summit this year, that what I was most buoyed by was the real desire for governments within the APAC area to actually work together and learn from each other. As Undersecretary Guevarra also mentioned, there's already been conversations between Victoria and the Philippines as a result of this. And I mean, being able to be part of providing forums that actually allow this type of regional collaboration, and seeing governments willing to collaborate and learn from each other, it's just so, yeah, you become very optimistic about what could be achieved. And I think you're quite right, Rebecca, that what's happening here in Asia, I think, is soon going to be the envy of many other markets around the world, in terms of that idea of collaboration and how governments can work together on some of these things, and also, I guess, learn the lessons that have been had over the many decades of installing offshore wind in Europe, to be able to actually apply those to their own regions, but also do it in a way that's kind of specific and keeps the natural integrity of each individual market. It's just it's really really came away feeling really bullish and really buoyed by what we were hearing in those markets. Anyway, that's all we have time for for today's episode. So again, thank you, Undersecretary Guevarra, for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you on. And again, as I said from the very start, you were the hit of the show, and I'm sure that this podcast will also be very popular amongst the listeners. So thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Stewart. Thank you, Rebecca.
So listeners, if you like what you heard, please remember to rate and review, and drop a comment. If there's any questions that you have about today's episode, let us know, and we'll be gladly happy to chat. You can hear all of this episode on all of your favorite streaming services, and there'll be excerpts of this also in the social media, so make sure that you keep an eye out for that. Thanks very much for listening, and catch you next time.
Goodbye.